We talked in the previous episode of Roman British history that the formation of and the desire of the Romans to conquer Britain came out of a political decision and the need to conquer Britain by Claudius. Today's episode is going to be a bit different. We're going to talk a little bit more about what it was about the system of empire that made it so desirable to continue to conquer. And what was it about Britain that would draw them to administratively want to govern a place which is difficult to govern, to be blunt? Let's talk about it more after the break. Welcome back to the Roman Britain podcast, episode 6, Forma Imperii. Before Rome ever landed soldiers on British shores in 43 CE, Britain had already been measured, judged, and classified, not morally, but administratively. Rome did not conquer places by accident, as you can imagine. It conquered them because they fit into a larger system of power, governance, and logistics that Rome had been refining for centuries. And that's what this is about. It's about the system. It's about the administration and why it became inherent in what they were trying to accomplish. What Rome meant when it claimed to rule somewhere, and how Roman government, supply, law, and culture traveled together in order to enforce that rule, and why those tools worked easily in some places like southern Gaul, and I would also argue in southeastern Britain, but had difficulty in other places like northern Spain and northern and western parts of Britain. This, of course, is the story of the empire before invasion. We're going to get there, don't worry. But for now, we want to continue to kind of set the scene and then make all the pieces of our concert come into place so that when we enter into the beginnings of the invasion, you already know and you've already been built up and understand how we've gotten there, why we're getting there, and why this occurred. Rome is often imagined as an army that builds cities afterwards. In reality, Rome was a state that used armies as a tool among many. By the 1st century CE, Rome had stable imperial structures. Power flowed downward from the emperor, but administration flowed outward through long-standing republican institutions. Governors were not generals improvising on the frontier. They were magistrates that defined authority, legal responsibility, and career consequences, and, importantly, collected money/taxes. This mattered because conquest was always followed immediately by governance. Rome did not fight wars it could not administer. A Roman province was not simply occupied territory, it was a legal category. Once declared a province, land became subject to Roman taxation, census, courts, and military oversight. Governors acted as judges. Roman law displaced local customs in matters that affect the state. This was an invasion, but it was also predictable. The Roman state prized order over brutality. Governors who destabilized provinces could be recalled, prosecuted, and quietly sidelined, and in worse cases, executed. Tacitus in Agricola later notes that Rome justified conquests as bringing peace, but judged governors harshly if that peace failed. Rome wanted provinces that paid reliably, recruited auxiliaries, and did not rebel. Britain would be evaluated against that standard, and to some degree would both succeed and fail. No Roman conquest happened without logistics. Legions consumed vast amounts of grain, equipment, animals, and labor. A single legion required thousands of tons of food annually. Rome's advantage was not bravery, it was, in fact, organization. We did talk a little bit when we talked about the military and the standardization of how people looked and the type of weapons they used and the formations they had. Well, this is the other half of that in the supplies that they got, in the way things worked. Everything was standardized and homogenized to try and make it as easy as possible to move things about. Supply chains stretched across continents. You couldn't have changeable roads and changeable wheels and changeable this and changeable that. Everything had to be the same. Roads were engineered, of course, for durability. Rivers were integrated into transport networks. A road, of course, was not built because Rome liked straight lines. It was built because it allowed movement of armies and information quickly. Rome's power left physical traces long before provinces were declared. Across Western Europe, archaeology shows that Rome rarely arrived to chaos. It arrived to landscapes already shaped by exchange, adaptation, and selective intimation. Material culture often moved faster than armies. Roman roads are among the clearest archaeological markers of intent. If Gaul and southern Britain roads linked towns, ports, and administrative centers, they also served for commerce as well as military movement. In resistant regions, roads do something else. They connect forts. In Spain, later Wales, Roman roads often run between military installations rather than civilian hubs. This tells us occupation preceded integration, rather than the other way around. Archaeology shows that Rome adapted to its strategic regionality. Where elites could be absorbed, towns flourished. Where they could not, forts dominated. Britain would experience both patterns simultaneously. In regions Rome would later conquer, we find Roman goods, building styles, and administration habits appearing decades before formal annexation. These traces show us how Rome tested territories before committing to it. Britain fits this pattern exactly. This is why Rome advanced methodically. A place that could not be supplied could not be held. Britain was not invaded until Rome was confident it could sustain occupation across the Channel. This is important when we're talking about these things. Rome just didn't just do stuff. It planned stuff well in advance. It made goals and achievable ideals. It used, as I said, specific systems that assisted them. Otherwise, it's an incredibly dangerous affair to send a bunch of troops over to an island which is completely blocked by water from the rest of your troops and the rest of your logistics across what is effectively a treacherous crossing at times of the year. So you have this system that you have in part to make it as easy as possible to do what you want to do. Rome rarely destroyed existing societies completely. Instead, it reshaped them. Urbanization was one of those key mechanisms, also integrating its religious movements into Roman ideals, building that commonality between various Roman gods and the local Roman god. You don't have Jupiter, you have Jupiter something else that's related to the god that previously was there working in a role that the Romans kind of thought looked a little Jupiter-esque. Kind of similar to the way they did all of their gods. Very much you'll see this pattern happen in Britain, and you'll see naming conventions of various places based off of this idea of creating an alignment between various Roman culture and local culture. Something that I think was very, very interesting to see and very different than a lot of other societies where you didn't just go to dominate, you came to conquest was also about totally overriding the previous culture, the previous society. It's something that the Romans did very cleverly, and it did work on their behalf in ancient times. Roman towns themselves created fixed centers of authority. They concentrated elites, administration, and wealth in one place. Forums were not decorative, they were political. Local leaders who cooperated were rewarded. Citizenship followed loyalty. Latin replaced local languages in official contexts, if not necessarily in everyday usage. Tacitus later remarks that Britons were taught to admire Roman comforts, baths, porticos, banquets, and rhetoric. This was not generosity, it was control. Culture was governance by other means, to be honest. Archaeology, of course, confirms what the Roman text suggests. Rome did not conquer blindly. It assessed landscapes, societies, and economies long before invasion. In Gaul, integration followed elite cooperation. In Spain, control required endurance. In Britain, both models existed side by side. This is why Roman Britain developed unevenly. Some regions Romanized quickly, others resisted for generations, and others were never conquered. The invasion of 43 CE was not the beginning of Roman influence, but it was the moment Rome decided influence was no longer enough. And you'll see when we talk a little bit about this, and we'll get in way more detail about this as we go along through the history of Roman Britain, you'll see a tendency of local cultural leadership elites to take on Roman looks. They go from being in hill forts and in roundhouses to suddenly being in very Roman looking manners that would not fit out of place in southern and central Italy. They're very much in the same style, even though they're being run and controlled likely by local elites rather than by some foreign born Roman official who's now living there. Yes, there were those, but the reality of it is most of the conquest is done in part by getting buy-in from the locals and having those locals spread that culture. Not everybody's going to buy it, shall we say, but I think for elites who see the benefit, especially financially and culturally, they would definitely be willing to buy into that and definitely want a part of that or a piece of that. And that's just an obvious outgrowth of this conquest. Gaul, of course, provides Rome's most successful model. Before Caesar, Gaul was politically fragmented but socially hierarchical. Tribes, elites already dominated local populations. Power was centralized enough to be captured. After conquest, Roman governors targeted those elites. They were often offered status, wealth, and eventual Roman citizenship. Their sons were educated in Roman ways. Cities like Lugdunum became administrative hubs. Within 2 generations, much of Gaul was culturally Roman. Rebellions occurred, but the system had largely held. Even after the Roman Empire fell, there was still within it an understanding of Rome and its existence to the point where the current language used there of French is a derivative of the Latin that was spoke there previously rather than being the probable Celtic language that was spoke prior to that. Rome learned a critical lesson. If local elites could be absorbed, resistance declined rapidly. This shaped Roman expectations elsewhere. In Gaul, archaeology confirms the speed and depth of the Roman integration. At sites like Lugdunum, as we mentioned, and Alesia, we see pre-Roman oppida transformed into Roman towns, defensive hilltops settlements given way to planned urban centers with forums, baths, and grid systems. Coin hoards showed rapid replacement of indigenous currencies with Roman issued. Imported pottery, especially Italian wine amphorae, appears in elite context before conquest and spreads rapidly afterward. What matters is not just presence, but concentration. Roman goods cluster around elite sites, and this reflects the deliberate targeting. Roman administrators knew who they needed to influence and how. By the early imperial period, Gallic elites were living in Roman houses, speaking Latin, and participating in imperial cult activities. Archaeology shows us that Gaul was not overridden, it was redirected. This was the model Rome hoped to replicate elsewhere. By comparison, of course, we have Spain. Spain, especially in the north and west, offered a harder challenge. Roman campaigns in Spain lasted centuries. Terrain was difficult, societies were decentralized, and warfare was persistent and local. Rome responded not with retreat, but endurance. In northern and western Iberia, archaeology shows prolonged militarization. Roman forts appeared in chains rather than in clusters. Roads were built in first for control, not commerce. Hill forts continued to be occupied long after the conquest had happened elsewhere. Roman material culture spread slowly and unevenly, and often only around the military sites. At places like Numantia, archaeology confirms what Roman writers had described: long sieges, destruction layers, and population displacement. Romanization in Spain was not immediate, it was enforced, gradual, and expensive. And of course, this is mattered for Britain. Rome knew that Spain Rome knew from Spain that some societies could not be absorbed quickly. They required long-term occupation and persistent force before Roman systems could take root. Fortresses, roads, and colonies were established slowly. Military presence remained heavy for generations. Spain taught Rome that some regions required long-term occupation before integration could begin. And of course, that also was a lesson that mattered enormously for Britain. Rome did not expect Britain to be another Gaul. It expected it might resemble another Spain. And in some cases, they was proved very accurate. In Britain, archaeology reveals a divided landscape. The southeast, Roman goods, of course, appeared early and often. Imported pottery, wine amphorae, glassware, and coinage are found in elite burials and settlement sites all along that eastern half of the South. This tells us something critical. Southern British elites were already participating in these Roman trade networks. They understood Roman status symbols and they adopted them deliberately. Coinage minted by client kings used Latin script and Roman iconography. This was not intimation for its own sake, it was a political signaling. By contrast, Western Britain shows far less Roman material before the invasion. Settlements remained focused on hill forts and enclosed farmsteads. Imported goods are rare and often arrive indirectly, and coinage, of course, is limited. This is not backwardness, it's the differential societal economy. Archaeology tells us Rome was already embedded in some British societies, but largely absent for others. Of course, Britain was not politically unified. Southern Britain featured a number of kingships, coinages, and trade networks. Power was concentrated enough for Rome to manipulate, but it was not concentrated so much that they controlled vast areas. And of course, Western Britain, along with Wales, were completely different. Communities were smaller, authority was dispersed, hill forts functioned as defensive and symbolic centers, not administrative ones. This diversity mattered. Rome did not conquer Britain in a single entity. It assessed regions individually. Some would be absorbed quickly, while others would require decades to enforce. One example of this, and one that we are going to get way into, is the Silures in southeast Wales. And the Silures exemplified Rome's problem. They occupied upland territory with few obvious political centers. Leadership was not easily isolated. Communities could fragment under pressure and reassemble later. Roman methods struggled here. There was no cities to capture and repurpose. There was no cooperative elites to install. No economic hubs to dominate. South Wales is defined by upland terrain, river valleys, and dispersed settlement patterns. Hill forts are numerous, but many are small, reused, and seasonally occupied. This mattered. Roman control relied on fixed centers, towns, administrative hubs, and road junctions. The Silures lived in a landscape that resisted this logic. There were no large urban centers to convert into Roman towns. Authority was local and flexible. Communities could be abandoned and returned later just as quickly as they were abandoned. Archaeology shows continuity rather than replacement. Even after the Roman military presence begins, traditional settlement patterns persist long after that. This is why the resistance endured. Rome could build forts, but it struggled to anchor society. And the Silures did not resist because they rejected civilization. They resisted because Roman civilization had nowhere to root itself. Tacitus later describes the Silures as stubborn and defiant, but what he describes is a society structurally resistant to Roman governance. Rome could defeat armies, but it struggled to conquer social organization. Yet, despite all this, despite all these challenges and problems, why did Rome proceed? Why did it just not leave Britain to be a client kingdom area? It's in part because Rome believed systems ultimately outlasted resistance. Gaul had adapted, Spain eventually was integrated. Rome assumed Britain would follow. More importantly, Rome believed in time itself was a weapon. Roads would come, towns would grow, elites would obviously change, and resistance could delay empire but not prevent it. By the time Roman legions crossed the Channel in 43 CE, the invasion was already decided, not by ambition alone, but by analysis. Rome believed Britain could be governed, supplied, taxed, and transformed. It knew resistance would occur and accepted that cost. The invasion was not necessarily reckless, it was instead very, very calculated. And as we finally reach the borders of the initial invasion, we're going to talk a little bit more about that and about how the theory of empire meets the reality of resistance in Britain, and how the various sides perceive one another, and how some would work with Rome and some would not, and why that was the case, and why there are parallels to some of our more modern views of the world. It makes a big difference to us when we see these kind of things, because we have to know that there are a lot of things about this invasion that will change Britain forever. The language of Britain, the ideals of what is Britain become totally changed forever. The language that will be spoke in the southern half of Britain will be a Romance style language, but with a Celtic twist. Eventually, it'll be called Brythonic. It will leap out of the end of the Roman Empire and continue onward in changed forms, which then become known to us now as Welsh, Cornish, Brythonic, and in other languages that develop out of this. And it differs from its sister languages such as Scottish, Irish, and Manx because it is influenced by so much of the Roman language. Also, we have and see that administrative centers and buildings become points of interest and will continue to be so long after the empire has fallen. In fact, it becomes a point of the Normans to remove British Roman buildings because they are sites for resistance and sites for authority of the old ways and of the old leadership. And so taking those down becomes massively critical to the Normans in enforcing their own version of authority and their own version of conquest that will be not dissimilar, but not the same as what the Romans had done previously. All of this, of course, is still to come. We have lots to talk about before we ever get anywhere near the end of the Roman British influence. And we have a long path to hoe way before that as we finally get into the full-on conflict between Rome and the southern part of Britain that is coming in AD 43 with the invasion led by the Claudian military. And with all of that, I'd like to thank you for viewing and listening today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach out to me on most social media at Welsh History Pod, although there is one exception, which is Facebook, facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. I actually am there now too, if you are interested, under the Welsh History Podcast as well. I should mention that more frequently than I do because I kind of forget sometimes to do that. As well, of course, we do have a Patreon where we helps to work through and gain the books and research that we do, which will become even more important this year as we are in 2026 and we have a little bit more time and effort to be able to do some on-site things, which will be great. With all that said and done, I hope you're having a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you later. So for that, please take care of yourselves. Until next time, bye-bye. The Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information about them, please follow them at evergreenpodcastnetwork.com. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.